So I have the distinct pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. David Lewis, who is a retired computer scientist, mathematician, faculty at Brown University, Cornell University, Ithaca College, also retired software engineer, now an independent researcher and my co-collaborator on what you'll be hearing in this next talk.
Thank you, and before I start, I have to make a confession. I'm not a therapist. I may be just about the only one in the room who's not a therapist or something like that. But I love therapists. I love them. I think they're doing the work of the world. And thank you. And I especially love the therapist who just introduced me, which I guess is not practicing equanimity. But that's just the way it goes. And in fact, who is also the co-author of this presentation. Absolutely, this is a collaboration. So, as a relative newcomer to the study of trauma, and that's what I am, I've noticed a good deal of ambiguity about the connection between trauma and meditation. I'd say if they were to proclaim their relationship on Facebook, they'd probably say, it's complicated. Deep but complicated. So taking a cue from Buddhism, as we've heard a number of times, there's attraction, aversion, and confusion. This symposium is clearly mostly about the attraction, the ways that contemplative practices, even though drawn from spiritual contexts where they're aimed at transcendent goals, can help alleviate the very worldly suffering of trauma. And as we see yesterday and today and to come, there are lots of ways for that to happen. But there are also notes of complexity. For one, trauma seems a little bit late to the mindfulness celebration. Despite considerable theoretical speculation and a handful of small but positive studies on treating PTSD with mindfulness-based interventions, MBIs, trauma has been conspicuously absent from the many lists of disorders that MBIs can successfully address, although it looks like Tony King and a few others may finally be changing that. But it's taken quite a while, and there are probably quite a few failed trials out there that we will just never hear about. On the aversion side, to complicate things even more, unmetabolized personal trauma, whether explicit PTSD or not, is generally considered a contraindication for meditation, or at least a problem to address off the cushion with a psychotherapist. The literature is replete with stories of people crashing out of retreats and entire meditation careers with what appear to be severe traumatic reactions. But now we're into confusion territory because sometimes these episodes are not due to personal trauma history, but are experiences that advanced meditators are supposed to have to one extent or another and supposed to work their way through on the cushion. In the Theravada, these are the so-called, for example, dukkhanas, or sometimes called dark night, states of fear and other unpleasant conditions that are a necessary precursor to certain significant meditation achievements that sometimes even beginning meditators without a trauma history encounter. And the Tibetans don't wait for these kinds of things to happen to them. Early in their path, they deliberately throw themselves into states of extreme fear by meditating intensively on hellacious realms of suffering far worse than those experienced by humans. And to top off the confusion, there are extremely positive states on the meditational path, such as witness consciousness, that seem to be mimicked by the dysfunctional traumatic conditional that are forms of dissociation, such as depersonalization or derealization, which Shinzen Young calls enlightenment's evil twin. So what we propose here today is a new way to look at the relationship between trauma and Buddhism that throws light on some of these complexities. And while we won't claim to solve these conundrums today, the model, we think, does point the way to solutions, and I'll mention where it does. Our model is based on Mahayana Buddhism in the Tibetan tradition, hence the title of the talk. But since the Tibetan Buddhism includes Theravada as a theoretical subset, even though the two have different maps of practice, much will still be familiar to the Theravada and modern-day mindfulness practitioners. So let's start at a theoretical level. A Mahayana analysis of PTSD. First, when I say Mahayana, you're probably thinking of compassion and the Bodhisattva ideal. But there's a lot more to the Mahayana, and the part I'm going to discuss today is more about the wisdom side, the two wings of the Mahayana, wisdom and compassion. We're going to be mostly on the wisdom side today. There are important relationships between the compassion side of Mahayana Buddhism and trauma, but we won't be doing that. To get started, we're going to use the Buddhist notion, common with all Buddhism, that the world we live in, called samsara, is a realm of suffering. Samsara is not a place, of course, although we talked about it as a realm, but it's a state of mind, our everyday state of mind, characterized by suffering, gross and subtle, not only birth, sickness, old age, and death, but the hidden suffering underlying even pleasant and neutral experiences because we cling to things that are by nature transient, which are bound to end, leaving us wanting. And by the way, this correlation between what we call cosmology, a realm, and psychology, a state of mind, is a common theme in Buddhism and other ancient religions, and we'll have more to say about that later. So the question is, why is our everyday life a realm of suffering? Overt and hidden. The Mahayana way of putting that root of suffering is what's called our misapprehension of inherent existence. Just to avoid too much clicking, I'm going to reveal the whole thing here, and we'll go through it point by point. The misapprehension of inherent existence, that our self and things in the world are independent, self-standing, or as we say, reified, when in fact, although we don't realize it, typically, they exist only in a web of interdependence. And that misapprehension of reified reality leads us to identify with the body and mind that we carry around with us everywhere, thinking, I am that body-mind. And since the body suffers injury, sickness, old age, and death, and the mind suffers, it resists, clings, denies, gets angry, obsessive, and so on, we suffer by that identification with them. And taking that one step farther, we have a self, a reified, inherently existent self that is saturated with suffering. So what's the relief from all this? The Mahayana language for that, and there's several terms, but the one we'll focus on here is called ultimate reality, or the celebrated emptiness, or more completely, emptiness of inherent existence. The cure for samsara is to see through our misapprehension of inherent existence and gain transconceptual insight into ultimate reality, emptiness, cured by the term selflessness or no self, and that's that there actually is a self, according to the Mahayana, and just not an inherently existent self, and likewise for things out in the world too. For how can we deny that there is a self that perceives, thinks, and acts? That would make us nihilists. There is a self, we just mistake its true nature. The notion, that notion, called conventional reality, that the self and things do exist, but not inherently, in a web of utter interdependence. So conventional and ultimate reality, according to the Mahayana, are really two sides of one coin, as are interdependence and emptiness. And the highest achievement is to simultaneously realize and live in ultimate and conventional reality, to see at once both the emptiness of self and things and their interdependent functioning in the world. So that's a little crash course in Mahayana wisdom ideas. What does it have to do with PTSD? The crucial observation that connects the two is that the phenomenological root of PTSD is what's called re-experiencing, intrusive re-experiencing, the involuntary reliving of the trauma as if it is still happening here and now. And much research confirms that that's really the distinction between PTSD and other maladies. And that leads in turn to the range of emotional, cognitive, and somatic symptoms of PTSD. So we can say, trying to connect these two ideas, that the PTSD sufferer is actually experiencing, at least sometimes, a profound misapprehension in the psychological realm. And they cannot integrate the traumatic event that happened to them into their experience and other memories, so it has kind of a hard shell. We could say a mistaken psychological inherent existence. And we can also characterize PTSD as identifying with one's body and mind at the time of the trauma rather than the actually present body and mind, which is really how it feels, according to reports from therapists and PTSD sufferers. So we call that, to continue the metaphor, it's actually more than a metaphor, we call that the PTSD sufferer's second self, that the trauma has become the new me. So there's a sense here of functional correlation between the Mahayana account of samsara and what we now understand about PTSD, given a lot of work in therapy by therapists, clinicians, and modern researchers. Just to be clear, though, we're not saying they are equivalent, far, far from it. But what we're proposing is there is a parallel structure. So continuing, what is healing PTSD? In these terms, it's getting back to the everyday, untraumatized self. And with a nod to John, it will be a different untraumatized self, but at least it won't be traumatized in the same way it was. Gaining insight that the traumatic misapprehension is just that, a misapprehension, that the trauma is not still present, not still dangerous, and not still a source of fear. We can't really call that ultimate reality, but the PTSD sufferer who may have lost hope feels it is pretty significant. So it's a relative ultimate reality, if you'll pardon the oxymoron. And the PTSD correlate of conventional reality is especially interesting. Despite the dysfunctional nature of the traumatic memory in PTSD, it is still an actual memory, not to be expunged, but instead integrated into the web of personal experience. In accomplishing that, the former PTSD sufferer lives comfortably with both realities at once, that the trauma did happen, their conventional reality, but it's now in the past, no longer threatening their healed ultimate reality. There's a lot more to this functional relationship between PTSD and samsara, and in the remainder of the talk, I want to present a couple more pieces of what you might call evidence that there's something significant going on here between Buddhism and trauma psychology that's out there, but hasn't really been recognized and brought together under one rubric. So that's the rest of the talk, to try and convince you, because I'm suspecting people are still a little skeptical. So we're going to use the concept of an analogy. Analogies are dangerous beasts. For example, protective headgear first. This is our protective headgear for the day. Analogies are dangerous beasts. So you can make this analogy, but it's not a very good one. They both go forward, and that's about it. But they don't have a lot of things in common. So we don't learn much about either side from this analogy. Here's a better one. They're very different beasts from a physiological point of view. One's a fish, one's a mammal, but there's a lot of similar things about them functionally, and we can learn, a lot about each from the other. But this isn't about fish, it's about samsara. And here's the symbol I'm going to use for samsara. It's a stock PowerPoint symbol, but it works perfectly. The sharp points are the suffering, and the whole thing is characterized by suffering, as we said. The red coloring indicates the overt parts of the suffering. You hit your thumb with a hammer, or you have a loss, or you're in a terrible situation, or you're facing death. And the lighter colored parts are the more subtle hidden parts, the more subtle hidden kinds of suffering, which hopefully we don't have too many of, and so I've drawn it in this way, although many people have much more suffering. But it's all suffering nonetheless, according to Buddhism. So, as a first pass, we're making an analogy between PTSD and samsara, and as I didn't mention it, but the red twiddle will be our analogy symbol. So we're making an analogy and a functional working model. It's really more than a metaphor. But this is not right. On many grounds, they are far from equivalent. We're not saying they're equivalent, so this diagram really can't be this symmetric. For starters, we need to do this, which is to say the suffering of PTSD is considerably more overt. In fact, it can pretty much even wipe out the pleasant and the neutral in one's life. So this would be a more appropriate diagram, but even that's not right because in a very real sense, samsara is a lot, quote, bigger than PTSD. Everybody has samsara, or almost everybody has samsara, if you think of it as something to have, whereas relatively few people actually get PTSD. And this scale may not even be quite right. And there's one more crucial feature about this analogical model that we're developing, and you've probably already thought about it, and that's this. PTSD is a subset of samsara. It's part of the suffering of samsara, so it has this double nature. It's both similar to the whole, and it's part of the whole. And mathematicians call this a fractal or a self-similar structure, and it's very interesting mathematically. And it's all bound up with cyclicness and complications, and this, we think, is part of the reason for many of the ambiguities about the relationship between meditation and trauma. And using this diagram, we can even start to articulate a little bit more of the model. Samsara is characterized by our normal, everyday functioning in the world self. The traumatic second self is what you acquire when you have PTSD. And the background to it all, you could say, if you wanted to really stretch a point, is the zeroth self, the emptiness, the, quote, no self. Although whether it's really background or not is a philosophic issue. Okay. So let's go on to the next realm of evidence that this is a fruitful, meaningful analogy. And that piece of evidence we will take from a general analysis of PTSD treatment versus Buddhist practice. So not just the theory of what they are and how they exist, but how we cure them or how we try to make them better. And again, this will be at a relatively high level with a Mahayana flavor, but elements common to other parts of Buddhism. So some quick review of PTSD treatment, which probably most of you know better than I do, is the concept of exposure. And I'm stealing this term back from prolonged exposure. By exposure, I mean any therapeutic exposure to a traumatic material, intentionally recalled, memories, triggers, and so on in therapy, not necessarily prolonged. So I'm kind of stealing that term back. I know most people exposure means prolonged exposure, but it's such a good term, I'd rather take it back to a more precise meaning. It's generally agreed that some exposure in this sense is required to resolve PTSD, to really get at it, to get at that re-experiencing in particular. The conundrum, of course, is that if you do exposure of any sort, no matter how gentle, traumatic reactions that ensue can disrupt therapy, and you won't get anywhere. The solution to the conundrum is the celebrated phase model of trauma treatment, which actually goes back to Pierre Genet, a contemporary of Freud who did not reject trauma. And phase one of this model is what's called safety and stability. Safety is first physical safety, that the traumatic events won't happen again. You need that first. And the reduction of traumatic fear through emotional safety and attentional we'll get to attentional stability in a second. Emotional safety and physical safety. So that's the safety side. The stability side is attentional stability in the sense of better control over both the hyper and the hypo-arousal that you can attend to the traumatic material in therapy, that is, do the necessary exposure work. Again, not necessarily prolonged exposure. So that's called phase one. Phase one also involves managing and reducing your symptoms somewhat despite still having PTSD, and thereby also gaining enough confidence in the therapist and the therapy that you can proceed with the difficult processing work ahead. Phase two of trauma processing aims at using exposure to elicit the traumatic material with safety and stability from phase one to keep things on track, and some system of trauma processing to actually end the re-experiencing and in some sense resolve the PTSD. Although, again, this model, I'm not being specific about whether we're dealing with complex or simple PTSD here, and of course resolving complex PTSD is not a simple matter, but actually resolving single incident PTSD is actually quite feasible, and it happens quite often in the therapist's office. In fact, there are many effective systems of trauma processing, and we're going to hear about 3 of them in the next panel. And of course, phases 1 and 2 are always somewhat interwoven in practice. Okay, so that's the therapy side. Let's jump to the Mahayana and also to some extent the Vajrayana side, Vajrayana being the esoteric branch of the Mahayana. Refuge is a profound practice in the Mahayana and Vajrayana, essential to gaining both wisdom and compassion. But it's downplayed or even omitted from modernized Buddhism. I did a search for it. I could barely find it in modernized forms of Buddhism. Why is that? People are probably thinking of it as unexamined faith or devotion, the formula you repeat at the start of every prayer or teaching practice. But in the Tibetan Mahayana, it's much more than that. It's a practice and a set of profound realizations motivated by intensive meditative reflection on the fears of samsara, like the hellacious realms I mentioned, and the nature of the Buddhist path to develop inspiration, experiential trust, confidence in the capacity of the Dharma to protect from and relieve suffering, and to develop confidence in your own ability to accomplish the goal. It's the support for all meditative practice, a gateway to the path. It's also, I think, related to what's called a Theravada stream entry. Just to give you a quick idea of the profundity of refuge practice in the Mahayana, Tibetan Mahayana, here's a visualization that monks do, and every set of monks has a similar visualization. This is Gelugpa monks with the founder of the Gelugpa order, Tsongkhapa, in the middle, your own teacher there down in the lower right, and lots of figures from the lineage and from your practice that you work on. And it's a very complex, profound visualization. And it goes along with reasoned inspiration and experiential trust. It's not just a devotional practice. So what we're claiming here is that phase 1 safety, remember phase 1 is safety and stability, but phase 1 safety is analogous to Buddhist refuge. Both protect from fear at their different levels. Both give you confidence in the path. Both are a gateway, a prerequisite to the path. But there are asymmetries. One asymmetry is that in PTSD, you're dealing with palpable fear, whereas in Buddhism, you're dealing with hidden fear, typically, although not always. And here, I won't go into it, the typical correlation of the objects of refuge, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, with elements of trauma therapy, or actually any kind of therapy. So here's a little diagram expressing this, a map of this. Phase 1 safety takes you from traumatic fear to everyday safety. Buddhist practice takes you, or at least enough like everyday safety that you can proceed with your therapy. Buddhist practice takes you from everyday safety to this place of profound refuge, confidence, and protection from the fears of samsara. Let's do stability now. That was safety. Stability. So we go back to Buddhism, and here is the archetypal Buddhist schema for meditation, which is not quite so clear in the mindfulness literature, but really both the Theravada and the Tibetans pretty much agree that this is the way they like to put it. There's two aspects to Buddhist meditation. The first, called calm abiding, or shamatha, other things, aims at giving you heightened, stable attention. You can keep your mind on things and also see things clearly, and it promotes a joyful, unified, light mind. The second aspect of Buddhist meditation is insight, seeing the true nature of self and phenomena, uses calm abiding to do what is the ultimate job of Buddhist meditation. This is the payoff, using calm abiding to see through to the true nature of insight. So that's another two-phase structure. Are they analogous? I think they are. We think they are. Functionally analogous in their realms. And the reason they are is both sides of the analogy are characterized, in a sense, by impaired attention. We don't usually think of ordinary attention as impaired until we try to meditate. And we find out we have distraction, excitement, anxiety, laxity, and we can't do it and say, oh my gosh, I never really had this attention. Some people think meditation gives them this bad effect, but it actually just helps them discover it. Prevents us from concentrating on our chosen object of meditation. And calm abiding meditation, it addresses that. And on the PTSD side, we can think of re-experiencing hyper and hypoarousal as attention problems on traumatic material, which can be a lot for a PTSD sufferer, that prevent them from focusing on their traumatic misapprehension. Phase 1 stability addresses that. And the specific attention problems here, by the way, do correspond. You can make a more detailed case, but I don't want to get, I'm seeing signs flashed at me, so I'm not going to get into it. Oh, by the way, since I'm not a therapist, they wouldn't have me on any of the panels, so they gave me my own cage. But in compensation, they gave me 10 extra minutes. So I'm going to run a little longer, but I hopefully won't run over too much. So here's a map of that territory. We did the safety. This is the stability side of phase 1. Phase 1 stability and trauma therapy takes you impaired attention to at least enough sort of everyday attention that you can do the job you need to do, which is see through the traumatic misapprehension, which, by the way, everybody can see through. It's not a big deal. Even you can see through it as a PTSD sufferer, but you're just still gripped by it. So it's a problem. How do you get ungripped by it? You got to be able to stare it in the face for a while. Buddhist practice takes you from everyday attention to this greatly enhanced attention that enables you to be able to see reality itself. So a quick map of the whole process. These are the three realms we've been talking about: PTSD, samsara, enlightenment. Of course, enlightenment really would be off the chart, much bigger than that, way off the chart. So we'll give up on that. We'll just use these three boxes just to simplify the graphics. And then we have phase 2, trauma processing, is what's used to work through the actual problems of PTSD. And insight meditation, the second aspect of Buddhist meditation, is used to take you from everyday consciousness on the path to enlightenment. Complete map, and I'll go through it quickly because we are short of time. This is the PTSD realm. It's characterized by fear and impaired attention. Phase 1, safety and stability, take you to a semblance of everyday safety and attention, enabling trauma processing, which gets you back to an untraumatized state. Similar map of Buddhist practice. You start with everyday safety and attention. Refuge practice, calm abiding meditation, support insight, which gets you on the path to enlightenment. And I don't mean to trivialize either of these profound paths, but I'm just trying to give a schema. Here they are put together, which I'm not going to give you time to look at. Okay, just a quick word about methodology and then the punchline for the whole talk. Here's Buddhism. It's huge. It's vast. Considered not even one Buddhism. There's many Buddhisms, ancient, modern, and in between. Okay, and it's got many beliefs, ideas, and practices that don't fit very well with the modern zeitgeist. Most Buddhism we see today is modernized. Those things have already been taken out of it or transformed into ideas that we can digest and deal with with our modern scientifically informed minds. But we don't have to worry about Buddhism per se because we have before us a different task, which is psychology, trauma psychology, which is to relieve the suffering of trauma. So one approach to that, and this is the approach that's essentially characterized by mindfulness methods, is to take a subset of Buddhism and map it into what turns out to be a subset of psychology as well, more or less intact, although with some mixing and matching. But it's still, it's still meditation. It's still quite recognizably Buddhist. It's just that you're not taking very much of Buddhism. But this works very well. I mean, mindfulness works wonderfully, and we've gotten a tremendous amount of mileage out of this. But interestingly enough, as you could tell from Tony's talk and from the research, mindfulness has not really addressed yet the hard nub of trauma, which is re-experiencing. Tony's intrusion figures kind of showed that. Tony, by the way, Tony's research, I don't know if people appreciate it, but Tony's research is doing essentially the best job so far of anybody who's been able to use mindfulness methods for trauma. So very quickly, our analogical model, we think, is doing something like this. It's trying to take a bigger swath of Buddhism, not all of it. So this diagram is not really accurate, nowhere near all of it, but a bigger swath of Buddhism, including some of these less digestible concepts, and map them into a bigger swath of trauma psychology and see if there's kind of anything interesting going on here. And in doing that, we have analogy versus truncation. We're trying to respect both sides. We're not reducing Buddhism to psychology, dismissing it, colonizing it. We wanted to study the differences as well as the similarities and explain the differences by wider principles. This is where the payoff is. We want to relate cosmology and psychology because there's so much cosmology in Buddhism, part of the indigestible parts. Okay, and that's already done within Buddhism, for example, by the samsara, the realm of suffering, the idea of a realm of suffering, which is actually a state of mind. And we want to use specific traditions on both sides rather than going with the impossibly huge and heterogeneous category of all Buddhism, or even all trauma psychology, for that matter. So I've been avoiding something. And now that I've done the methodology, I think I can reveal that samsara is the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Those very unmodern concepts, especially rebirth, and this slide's already been up by Tony. Who had this slide up? Jim. Right. So this is the Tibetan depiction of the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. So how are we going to deal with rebirth? Okay, the idea that beings wander from life to life until we figure things out through enlightenment. We've agreed, at least tentatively if you're with me, not to reduce or dismiss this kind of stuff. At least, and also relate cosmology and psychology. So how are we going to do that? It's a cycle. Samsara is a cycle. The question is there a cycle we're going to have to find a cycle in trauma. Well, there is a cycle in trauma. It's the re-experiencing avoidance cycle. As I said, re-experiencing is the phenomenological root of trauma, PTSD, but avoidance is in a sense also because a trauma sufferer is either in one or the other, and they're going back and forth. If they're under control, they're spending most of their time not thinking about their trauma triggers or their trauma memories, and therefore in avoidance and having a relatively normal life. You might look at them and say they're okay, but if a trauma trigger comes along and they're plunged into re-experiencing until they get out of it, and then they're back to avoidance. So there is a kind of a cycle going on here, and let's see if we can make something of it. So let's first look at the samsaric cycle. You're in a samsara, that's the Buddhist cycle. You're in a samsaric life. Death arrives and dissolves that samsaric life, plunging you into what's called the bardo, the state between lives. Now, the bardo is a bad place. It's a fearful place for most people. You do come face to face, because your body and mind now either dissolve or go into a very subtle state, according to Buddhism, you actually come face to face with emptiness in the bardo. And that sounds great. Isn't that what we're trying to do? But it doesn't work because unless your mind is highly trained to recognize that when you see it, it feels like annihilation, the most fearful possible thing you can imagine, and you black out in the bardo, and that's the black hole inside the symbol. You black out, then you go through rebirth, having forgotten everything. You wake up again in a new samsaric life. And by the way, in a new samsaric life, having forgotten about the previous one, the blackout was so total that you forgot about everything, and you're just in a new samsaric life, and everything is regenerated, and you play it again into the endless future and back into the endless past until you figure it out. So, does PTSD line up with that? Well, maybe. So here's an avoidant period, but still traumatized. You're not thinking about your trauma. Just like in samsaric life, you're not thinking about death. We try to avoid thinking about death. But eventually a trigger arrives, and you're plunged into re-experiencing. So the question is there in re-experiencing anything akin to the blackout? Well, thanks to Jared, I know my time's up, but I'm almost done. Thanks to Jared, we actually had a little discourse on what the blackout is. It's called freeze, or actually, Deborah and I like to call it fold, because there's another use for the term freeze. But it's the final primitive reptilian mammalian defense mechanism, which is for the cognition and everything to shut down, so you don't really feel or think or know what's going on. And that's equivalent to the Bardo blackout, if we buy this model. And in fact, some people think it is, in some sense, the mechanism that leads to problems like dissociation or PTSD itself. Eventually, you return to the present, your next avoidant period, because you had this blackout in your re-experiencing, or to one extent or another, because it was like the original trauma, you're in your next avoidant period, and so on into the beginningless future. And I actually have beginningless past here, but that's a big difference. There is no beginningless past with PTSD. It has a beginning. So the conclusion is trauma is driven by an unexpected encounter with death. The body if the body dies in this encounter with death, then you're in a new samsaric cycle. You die. You're in the Buddhist realm then. But if you survive, then you're still within this life. Now you're still within psychology, but the mind thought it was about to die, and it wakes up in the same body with the old samsaric life, but now traumatized and driven into that even worse cycle that resembles the larger samsaric cycle. And if you buy all of this, and there's quite a bit more evidence that obviously we don't have time for here, what we're saying is that samsara is kind of a transcendental trauma, or transcendental PTSD, and PTSD is kind of a mundane psychological version of samsara. And that's the analogy. Cute, huh?